The most powerful technique in all of science is experimental research, and the same is true in the field of psychopathology. It is the only technique that allows us to draw unambiguously a causal conclusion. Now, the logic of it works this way. We'll start with a group of people. In psychology, we always use groups because, well, we have differences between people. So we're looking for patterns across people who are different from one another. So we get a group of people, let's say 100 people. We are going to create two groups from that group, but we're going to do it by randomly assigning them to the groups. Maybe we'll flip a coin to decide whether they're in this group or this group. Random assignment tends to equate the groups. Now, if there are only two people and we randomly assign it, the equating of the groups is not very good. But the larger the sample size, the more the groups tend to be equal on just about anything that we can measure. But they're not perfectly equal. We'll come back to that in a minute. But it tends to equate the groups. So now we have two groups that are equal. And we're going to treat them exactly the same, except for one thing, which we're going to call the independent variable. So perhaps our groups are two people, or two groups of 50 people each who are depressed. One group is going to get a treatment, and the other group is not going to get the treatment. So maybe it's a pill designed to reduce the depression. So we treat them exactly alike except for the treatment. If at the end, since they started out equal, they are no longer equal, perhaps our treatment group has lower depression, then we can assume that the treatment that only one group received is the difference for that observed difference between the groups, is the reason for that observed difference between the groups. The treatment caused the improvement. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, this is the most powerful technique we have, and yet, except for treatment studies, we almost never use it in the field of psychopathology. Most of my career, my research was in psychopathology until I changed the focus of my research to another field when I joined the faculty at YSU. I had never done an experiment. Why? Because experiments in psychopathology are often either impossible or unethical or both. Let me give you an example, with several examples. I cannot randomly assign people to either have schizophrenia or not. It just can't be done. They have it or they don't. I can look at people who have the disorder and people who don't have the disorder, but they were not randomly assigned. And because they were not randomly assigned, they tend not to be equal at the beginning. So if I find a difference, I don't know whether it's the disorder or some other difference between the group that accounts for it. But it would also be unethical for me to do that. If I could make someone be schizophrenic, I can't do that for research, no matter how good the research, no matter how important the research. Give you another example. If I believe that childhood abuse makes children more likely to get depressed as adults, can you imagine doing a study where you take 100 kids and separate them randomly into two groups and then tell the parents of one of the groups, now I want you to abuse your children because I want to see if they get depressed later on? I mean, they would think you were crazy and certainly evil. You just don't do things like that. Because of that, most of the research in the field of psychopathology does not involve experiments, except for treatment. We always do treatment studies with experimental designs. What that means is that it's harder for us to ever draw causal conclusions. Experiments work very well in drawing causal conclusions, but they're unethical or impossible in this field. Let me go back briefly and define a couple of terms that are going to be very important in our discussion throughout the entire course. When I do an experiment, the variable that I manipulate is called the independent variable. Okay? Manipulate means that I decide what each group gets. So if it's a treatment study, I decide which group gets the treatment and which group does not get the treatment. The dependent variable is the variable that we measure, and often it's more than one variable, to see whether there is an effect. One way of remembering the difference is that we expect, when we do an experiment, that the dependent variable's level will depend on the level of the independent variable. So if you get the treatment, you're more likely to show fewer symptoms. So the level of treatment, get it or not, is going to determine whether or not you are better. Now, why do we use many dependent measures? If you take a disorder like depression, we might want to measure the feeling of being depressed, which we could do with a measure like the Beck Depression Inventory, which is widely used to measure depression. But people who are depressed often don't function as well, so we might want to look at their productivity at work. And they may not be as active, especially in social situations. They may be avoiding people, so we may want to look at the number of social contacts. So if our drug that treats depression is working well, it'll make the person feel less depressed, be out in social situations more, and be more productive at work. Remember, I said that the logic of the experiment is we create groups that are equal at the beginning, and then we treat them exactly the same except for the independent variable manipulation. So if we're studying a drug treatment for depression, we'll have two groups of depressed individuals, and one gets the drug and one does not. But treating people exactly the same requires more than just talking to them the same. If I give one group a drug and I don't do anything with the other group is not only not getting the drug, but they're not getting anything. So they know they're not getting a treatment. Now, if I give someone a drug that really isn't active, it doesn't work. Some people are going to get better through something called the placebo effect. Now, the placebo effect is a form of an expectancy effect. They will get better because they expect to get better. Expectancy is a very powerful effect with human beings. So, I will give the control group a drug too, but they won't know whether that drug is the experimental drug or basically a sugar pill, a placebo. Because both groups get the drugs, both groups have the expectation that they will get better, even though only one group gets the drug that we think will make people better. Now, how do we control expectation? We can create a blind situation with our subjects, for example, by all of them getting a drug. It's just that some of them get the experimental drug and others get the control drug or the placebo. That's called a single blind. But expectancy doesn't just affect the subjects. It also affects the experimenter because they're people too. So the experimenter expects that the drug will work. So their observations are going to be distorted so that they'll tend to see the drug working whether it is or not. Now, I know what you think. You're thinking, oh, that's garbage. Seeing is believing. Of course I could tell whether it's not. Every police officer will tell you every time there's a crime and there's 4 witnesses, there are 4 different descriptions of the crime and what happened and the person who committed the crime. We are terrible observers, and our expectancies dramatically, not just slightly, dramatically affect our observations. So we want the experimenters who are measuring how depressed or not depressed the individual is to be blind, as well as the subjects to be blind about who's getting the drug and who's not. That's called a double-blind experiment, and it protects against the expectancies that subjects have and the expectancies that the researchers have. This slide summarizes something that I said earlier and also gives some examples. We tend to use experiments with all of our treatment studies. In fact, a treatment study that is not an experimental design would probably not get published in a good journal. We can also use experiments for certain kinds of experiences, as long as the experiences are not too extreme, because if they're too extreme, they become unethical. So I can put individuals in situations where they're frustrated and compare people who are frustrated with people who are not frustrated. But I can't put them in life-threatening situations because that's unethical. So some experimental manipulations are possible, but usually they have to be mild. As I said, there aren't many experiments in the field of psychopathology except for treatment studies because they're either unethical or impossible. When I introduced the idea of experimental research, I said that we typically do experimental research with groups of subjects, and the reason we do that in the field of psychology in general and psychopathology in particular is that individuals are different. So we want to see what the average performance is. Does a treatment work for most people? Not just one person, but most people. But sometimes we're only interested in a single subject. If you're a clinician and you're treating a subject, you want to know if your subject is getting better as a result of your treatment. So we have to have another approach, and we call that the single subject experimental research. Now, we don't have any control group here, so we can't control things, but what we can do is take experimental control of the manipulation. So in a single subject design, what we typically will do is we will measure repeatedly over time the variable of interest. If the person is depressed and we want to treat them for depression, we'll measure their level of depression, both before and after, and usually during the treatment as well. So we can see the pattern of scores. The advantage of repeated measures is it allows us to see a pattern. When you're depressed, for example, you're not always depressed the same level every day. You have better days and not so good days. You may be depressed every day, but the depression goes up and down. If I don't have multiple measures, I could easily have 2 days where the depression went up and then down, and it looks like a big change, but in fact it was just normal variation. The multiple measures allows us to determine that. We already talked about how some manipulations are unethical, but there are other ethical issues that I want to talk about with respect to psychopathology research. We are always working with vulnerable populations. Anyone who has a psychological disorder is affected by that. And some of them will be desperate because of the effect that the disorder is having on them. So we have to be aware of that. We have to take that into account. We have to treat people fairly. All research with human subjects, whether it's psychological or medical or, well, any field, has to be reviewed at every hospital or university that conducts that research by a group called the Institutional Review Board. At this point in time, as I'm recording this, I'm a member of the IRB, Institutional Review Board for YSU, and have been, I believe, for 6 years. Our job is to review every proposal and make sure that every effort has been made to reduce the risk, and if there is a risk, there is a benefit large enough to justify taking the risk. No study is completely risk-free, but if there is risk, there has to be a really good reason to justify the study. One of the ways we control risk is we make sure that the subject is the person who decides whether he or she will be in the study. They have to give their consent. But they have to give their consent after knowing what the study involves and what the risks are. So their consent must be an informed consent. And we usually do that in writing by laying everything out and having them sign the thing. I'm happy to report that the American Psychological Association was the very first organization to create a code of ethics for research. They did that 20 years before any other organization for human subjects, and over 40 years before any other organization did it for animals studies. So the APA, American Psychological Association, has been at the forefront of establishing ethical guidelines for research, not only with humans, but with animals as well. So that's an overview of the field of psychopathology, how we define abnormality, and how we go about studying it.